My name is Rika Rani, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Affairs. On behalf of the editorial and faculty advisory boards of the journal and our co-sponsors at the Earth Institute, I would like to thank you for joining us this evening for our Thought Leadership Forum on Innovating for Development. The theme of innovation and its profound impact on international relations made its debut in the pages of the Journal of International Affairs in 1959, with the publication of our spring issue, Science and World Politics. The editors of that issue referred to their era as the atomic age, saying that it is in the realm of scientific techniques of inspection and control that man can presently see his greatest hopes for survival amidst the means of total destruction. This statement is worth recalling even today, as governments from around the globe gather in Cancun to discuss how they can address the impacts of man-made climate change. More than ever before, the world has at its disposal a dynamic arsenal of tools for the achievement of development goals. In recent years, we've seen the novel use of mobile technology to promote public health. In Haiti, we've seen in real time the utility of open source mapping in humanitarian emergencies. And across the world, governments are making dramatic investments in greener energy technologies to help mitigate the effects of greenhouse gas emissions. Tonight, the journal is proud to announce the launch of its Fall-Winter 2010 issue, Innovating for Development. This issue of the journal critically examines what innovation can and cannot do in the context of sustainable development. It highlights not just the use of innovative technologies, but the policies, structures, and incentives that facilitate its diffusion and transfer. Contributions to this issue cover a wide range of topics, including technology transfer, one laptop per child, the role of universities in promoting global public health, and the impact of copyright systems on economic development. I am pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists, who will be addressing some of these and other important issues in their discussion tonight. In particular, tonight's discussion will focus on how innovation is driving the agenda for climate change, natural resource use, and energy policy. But before we begin our discussion this evening, I'd like to ask for your indulgence for a moment in thanking a few people without whose support tonight's event would not be possible. On behalf of the editorial board, I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to this issue's contributors, one of whom, Mr. David Driesen, we are honored to have here tonight. We would also like to thank our esteemed advisory board, Dean Coatsworth, and the administration here at SIPA. We'd also like to thank Professor Scott Barrett, who served as advisor on this issue, and everyone in SIPA IT, external communications, and facilities for their instrumental support. Finally, to all of our editorial, production, and digital assistants, I know many of you are here tonight. We cannot thank you enough for your dedication. Moderating our discussion tonight is Dr. Stephen Cohen, Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of the Earth Institute. Over the past 3 decades, Dr. Cohen has been at the forefront of thinking on environmental policy and sustainable development. After spending several years at the Environmental Protection Agency, Dr. Cohen joined the Columbia University faculty and has since played a crucial role in building programs here at SIPA and at the Earth Institute. His work truly encapsulates the idea of innovating for development, and we are very honored to have him moderating our discussion tonight. Dr. Cohen, welcome.
Thank you. And I want to thank the Journal for providing us with these very comfortable chairs. I think the panelists and I may be taking a nap here in a little while if we don't really liven things up for you. So today we're going to talk with you about the whole issue of innovation and development and the role of technology. Technology is what has created all of these wonders, like the nuclear power you just heard about. Too cheap to meter was the expression I think they used back then. Or as Barry Commoner once put it, a hell of a complicated way to boil water. Technology is both what's created this wonderful lifestyle that many of us enjoy and has also created these problems that we have to address. And today's panel is going to talk about the use of technology and innovation. How do we bring technologies into our economy? How do we solve the problems that humanity faces through the use of hopefully creative and innovative technology? We were talking downstairs before. I was thinking about how complicated this issue is and how unpredictable technologies are. Paul and I were talking about the cell phone. Nobody would have predicted 2 decades ago that the average student at SEPA would not have a telephone landline in their apartment, but in fact would have a cell phone instead. And it's just a small indicator of how difficult it is to predict the future when it comes to technology. And we'll be hearing more about that. But let me quickly get to introduce our distinguished panel. You all have a program, I believe, yes? Everybody here have a program? So I'm not going to read through everything about these folks because you can do that yourself. But Professor Dreesen, who you've just heard about, is a university professor at Syracuse. And he works on the economic dynamics of environmental law. He's, in fact, an environmental lawyer and an excellent one who has written about environmental policy in some very compelling and interesting ways, and so we'll be hearing from him. Seated next to him is somebody who's familiar to SEPA students because he's a visiting professor, Professor Pinho, who has come to us from Portugal, where from 2005 to 2009, he was the Minister of Economy and Innovation and a member of the Parliament. And so here we have both an academic and a policymaker. And seated next to him is another distinguished visitor from Europe, Professor Tubiana, who is both the founder of the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations in Paris, but also from 1997 to 2002, served as a senior advisor to Prime Minister Lionel Jospin on environmental issues. And so we have another distinguished practitioner academic as part of our panel. Next to her is my colleague from the Earth Institute from the Engineering School, the director of Columbia's Water Center, Professor Manu Lau, who is one of the most creative and interesting thinkers on global water problems that we have, and has thought long and hard about the use of technology to solve the world's water problems. And last but not least, at the very end, is Professor Paul Hudnut, who is co-director of Colorado State's Global Innovation Center for Energy, Health, and Environment. He also is a lawyer and one who is working on crucial energy and environmental issues. And so what the format of the panel is each of our panelists will speak with you for 5 minutes and offer their perspective. Then I'm going to try to get them to fight with each other a little bit, liven things up. Then I'm going to invite you to argue with us and tell us why we're all hopelessly out of date. So we'll start immediately to my left.
Okay, well, what I want to talk about very briefly in 5 minutes is about trying to get technology transfer to developing countries for addressing climate disruption. And the key vision here is, people would love to see a leapfrog effect where developing countries would move to clean technologies without having to go through the dirty ones. But the key developing countries here, like China and India, already have lots of dirty technology, so it's going to be more complicated than that. But everybody agrees that this is at the heart of the challenge, is if we can get the kind of technological transfer in developing countries as well as in developed countries to address climate disruption. And it's absolutely essential both for sustainable development and economic development, because if we don't address this properly, we're going to have big economic problems, both because climate disruption itself is an economic calamity and because fossil fuel will run out. And before it runs out, it's going to become very expensive and wreak economic havoc that way. So we really need to do this. The question is how. And there are two basic governance mechanisms that try to address technology transfer to developing countries. We might call them trade and aid. The trade model is used in the clean development mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol, where the idea is that developed countries will fund projects in developing countries in lieu of local reductions that they would otherwise be obligated to make. So that's the clean development mechanism, where people get out of their emission reduction obligations locally by funding projects in developing countries, and that's a means of technology transfer. Another means we also see in the Kyoto Protocol, but it's more robust in the Montreal Protocol, is a government aid model. And there you have an international institution with government funds used to fund technologies abroad. And so our task is to meld these things or choose the right one in some way. And I would say that there are three big policy attributes you have to look for this to work: positive spillover, scale, and additionality. I want to talk briefly about each of these things. In the CDM in particular, the CDM never adds emission reductions net. It is always about trade. So you always give up something to get one. So there's no environmental value to the clean development mechanism. There is a cost effectiveness value, unless there's a positive spillover. That is, unless by doing a project in a developing country, you increase people's knowledge and capacity, increase the possibility of developing countries enacting climate disruption policies, as some have. China has strict standards for vehicles, and there are other policies abroad that have tried to do that, and we need more of that. So positive spillovers are very important. The other thing is scale. And this is widely recognized in the international community. To have an influence, it's not enough to have a few projects going on. I mean, if we're building a coal-fired power plant every week and we have a few renewable energy projects going along on the side, that isn't good enough. So there's have to be massive increases in the scale of technology transfer. And for that reason, it's likely that the international regime will continue with the CDM and add some kind of aid component if they can come up with the financing. Finally, additionality. This has been a big problem with the CDM. That is, the first thing that people do is not new innovation in a trading program. They try to get credit for what they've already done. And it's been hard to police that. So the net effect is you lose emission reductions because people get credit for what they're going to do anyway, instead of for new projects. And that's a big challenge for the CDM, and there's a comparable problem of waste that could arise in international, in an international aid model. So additionality is a problem. That is, the idea is you want each project you fund that you give up an emission reduction in Europe for to be an additional new project, not just a project developer capitalizing on something that's already been funded in the developing country. So by way of summary, we have these two models of a trade program exemplified by CDM or a potential aid model where governments come up with the money rather than the private sector. In any model, you need positive spillovers. You need to have increases in local knowledge and capacity coming out of technology transfer. You need a much bigger scale of technology transfer to have an impact on the main trends in developing countries. And you need an additionality. You need strict criteria to see to it that projects that are being purchased with emission credits are actually adding something and not just claiming for credit for what's already being done.
What's your opinion?
Thank you, Steve. Well, first of all, I would like to say that I'm delighted to be here at the forum of the Journal of International Affairs. I thank you for inviting me. I've been a visiting professor at SIPA for this last semester, who's coming to an end. This was a great experience to me, and what has impressed me the most was the great quality of the students and your interest in energy policy. Energy and the environment are, for sure, one of the top challenges of the 21st century. The demand for energy increased by, and I'll use some units, 5,000 millions of tons of oil equivalent in the last 20 years, and is supposed to increase by the same over the next 25 years. So this means that energy demand will increase by 25% over the next 20 years. 95% of this increase will come from non-OECD countries. So this will be a matter of China, China, and China. Then, fossil fuels represent 80% of energy consumption, like it or not. So, in 10 years, in 30 years, in 50 years, we'll be here discussing how to replace fossil fuels, but we'll be speaking about them because something that is a law is that fuel cycles are extremely long. Coal took more than 100 years to replace biomass, and then oil took 100 years to replace coal. So now it will only be in the next 5 or 10 years that we will be able to live without fossil fuels. At the same time, we have this energy challenge, we have an environment challenge. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt of the close correlation between CO2 concentrations and the global temperature of the planet, and it's disturbing that what we have witnessing over the last 100 years has been not witnessed over the last 5,000 years. And the increase in CO2 emissions is man-made, and 75% of that is related to energy. So there is an extremely close connection between energy and the environment. Something that has surprised me the most here is that there is a kind of ideologic debate between energy and the environment. So it's a kind of debate between left and right. I would say that it is rather a debate of right or wrong, because what we need is action, and we need action now to create a new energy era. I call it a new energy era, ERA, efficiency, E, R, renewable energy, and A, advanced thermal generation, and that is the name of a plan that Europe has approved called the SET plan, the technology plan for energy, and we come to technology. The main messages of this plan are the following. First, there is no silver bullet. There is no miracle solution to create a sustainable relation between the environment and energy, but we have already technologies that are extremely close to do the job. Then all the sectors must be involved. Yes, I mean, it's not only a matter of energy, of electricity, transportation, it's a matter of all the sectors that create the society. Now, we can quantify the new energy era. The new energy era will be 50% energy efficiency, 20% renewable energy, and 30% advanced thermal generation. And by this, we can include the new oil plays, carbon capture and storage, supercritical coal power plants, third generation nuclear. We'll need this, and as humanity was able in the 19th century to produce an industrial revolution that has led to unprecedented growth in living standards, I'm sure that, again, without debates of left and right, we'll be able again to meet this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Tubiana.
Thank you, Steve. Again, I would certainly repeat the extreme pleasure I had to be a visiting professor at SIPA. It was a wonderful fall with the students, and really a wonderful experience to discuss with colleagues. So SIPA is somehow an addiction. When you begin to come here, then you long to come back. So I'm finishing like my colleague this fall, but I will be very happy to be in touch with a student, my colleague, and come back. So I think that your program is really functioning to have people come back.
I'll make sure the dean heard that and turns that into a commitment.
So I will not repeat. So it was excellent. Our two first introduction. As being just yesterday, this morning, even in Cancun, in the COP16, I would like to point some elements of the political economy of the discussion on technology, transfer and cooperation. And maybe first, it has been conceived from the beginning, technology transfer as a price to have really to pay for, and have the developing countries on board on the decarbonization of the economy, or more, because it is a very long-term goal, to have the developing countries align with the idea that combating climate change could be a development policy too. And I, looking back at the convention in 1992, Kyoto Protocol, and the painful discussion from Bali to nowadays, we see that development is now And that's good. More and more at the center of the climate talks, and technology, of course, plays a central role to convince countries that they can have a different energy mix and a different energy demand structure. But even if it's a sort of a very good and essential dimension of the climate talks, it has, in a way, be played very much against having timetables and targets for a number of big emitters. Technology has been seen as a way to avoid commitments on the levels of emissions. Of course, not talking about the small developing countries, which are the only thing they have is to increase their emission at the first stage, but talking about, of course, United States, China, and even less developed countries like India or South Africa, technology has been seen as a way to avoid commitments on the global emission targets, and that has introduced, in a way, I think, a damaging element on the discussion on technology cooperation. But we can come back to that again. But part, for example, of the Bush administration has been to try to have a discussion on technology, not to have the discussion on the targets. But now things are getting, in a way, better, because everybody sees that we need to have, if I follow the professor, we need to have this industrial revolution. Nobody has the solution, the technology solution. It's much more about gigantic efforts of technology cooperation to to have breakthrough in solar energy, in renewable energy in general, in solar in particular, in the storage of electricity, a number of issues where we don't know the responses and where technology cooperation will play a major role. So from a sort of a way of avoiding a discussion on how countries will commit to targets, we are slowly entering in a much more positive mood, which is we need that industrial revolution, how we organize together or how we compete together to produce this new technology. But we come back on this cooperation versus competition aspect, which is playing a very strong role. But the issue is, what we see is there are now countries like India and China and Korea in particular that really through public spendings, research and development programs, and public procurement are really giving signals that they believe in this clean energy future. But on the other side, we see, in spite of these very positive developments, we see huge problems of deployment of these technologies. I could think around two dimensions. First is, of course, the problem of decarbonizing the energy mix. And the second is about controlling the energy demand curves and evolutions. And that is very much about upfront finance. For a number of countries, even to really control energy demand, is about infrastructure policy, energy efficiency in the building, urban planning, more so to avoid cost in mobility and transport. But in a way, a lot more attention is paid in this technology cooperation debate on the high end of the technology. Electric vehicles, CCS, is now more at the core of the discussion on technology, more than the problems of deployment. And of course, because many problems of deployment is about finance. And finally, I would sort of raise the idea that a lot would be around the policy design. Very much, and I finish with that, the idea was with a strong carbon price, we will have this technology deployment, and now we'll realize that this is a view, it's sort of a very theoretical view of how things are. We need policy that can allow technology to deploy. These policies have a cost. We have a transition cost to face for decarbonizing this energy mix, and that is really then the technology links with a discussion of finance, like it was said on the CDM, but much more with a bigger scale to allow this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Lau.
This is an interesting discussion, and I think I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. At the beginning of this session, there was a remark that when the JIA issue originally came out, it was the atomic age. When it was the atomic age, it was pretty clear that you needed Superman, and it was pretty clear that you needed kryptonite to balance out Superman. What I'm getting at is that the double-edged sword of technology was made very clear at that time. In the case that we were discussing here now with carbon, this has been a slower discovery path. But it's a similar story, and today I would say that what you're going to get taken through, largely because of the rate at which our populations have grown, thanks to technology again, is the alphabet trip. Okay, the alphabet trip starts with uranium U, sulfur S, carbon C, water H, for example, to cut it short, nitrogen N, phosphorus P, and the point I'm making is all of these are things that we think we need, we do. The same elements end up as either things that we are short of or things that are going to cause us harm in some way. But these are all fundamental to technology. And today's technology, rather than the atomic technology, is headed towards nanotechnology and biomimicry. So instead of Superman, if you want something, a nice little doll for your kid, you probably are thinking of nano friends, which is pretty good because you can imagine them, right? These are 10 to the minus 9 meter creatures, so you can get lots of them for your little kid. The story here is the following. If you look at the problem that everybody is discussing today, it's carbon and climate. But fundamentally, the story of humanity is one where we have managed to creep past whatever anybody thought were limits on sustainability through advances made on a specific constraint that was emerging at the time. The constraint that people are pointing to today is a renewable energy source. My argument is that well before that, we are going to start running into the food-water constraint. These are all interdependent, but we'll see that. And we are already seeing that in places that are densely populated and have high variability in natural renewable water supply, namely India and China. So if you talk to the Chinese and you bring up the point that Professor Pena did about their energy constraint, they actually have a more fundamental food constraint, ultimately. I would actually argue that they have solved that constraint better than India because they have a better population growth strategy. So there's that piece of it which will work. Now, if I'm saying that we'll hit that constraint before we hit a constraint posed by climate, then I have to advance some arguments as to how technology is going to get us out of that, because, of course, our goal is to be 1,000 billion people on this planet, because most people love to live beyond their means, create technological bubbles, create financial bubbles, and then watch them burst and move to the next one. So how are we going to solve the water problem, and how are we going to solve the food problem? The biomimicry angle and the nano angle come into play here. Today, we have technologies available that can allow you to dial up a protein of your choice. You want chicken, you want wheat protein, you can have that, and all you need for this is solar energy, salt water, nitrogen from the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide in a concentrated stream. Okay? There's many such things floating around there which bring up the question of whether that product would be something you're willing to eat. There are technologies out there today that say that we can start growing rice, which is the largest water consumer. By the way, in places like India, 40 to 60% of the total electricity in the agricultural areas goes for pumping groundwater. Okay? Similarly, much of the energy used for producing fertilizer is what gives you the high food output that we have today. So if we can get around all of these issues, we have a magical solution. So people have them. If you can go and grow rice in the ocean margin using salt water, that takes away the water problem because that's one of the largest consumers. Can we do it? Yes, it's done now. Okay? So the thing is, the question that was put before us is, what's the relationship between technology and development? And to try to sum up my argument, I'll say that technology is development. Technology also poses the constraints of development because what we have repeatedly found is that each advance that we make leads us to a new constraint, which we solve. So will we get to 1,000 billion people? I think so. I think that is how we got to this planet, because we ruined the previous planet we were on with 1,000 billion people and somehow migrated here. And there are very, very many stories of how you can argue that happened. But the fact of it is that I think growth will happen, and development is synonymous with growth to a certain extent. At the Earth Institute, we talk about sustainable development, which many people will argue is an oxymoron, because sustainability is viewed as a paradigm which is status quo. And we have learned that that's simply not what it is. We are going to evolve, and we'll have ups and downs, and we'll have evolution all through there. The goal of sustainable development really should be to minimize the downs as we are going up. And with that, I will stop and pass on.
Okay, Professor Hudna.
Sometimes I sit on these panels and wonder, it's so interesting to hear my fellow panelists. And I'd love to try this addiction to SEPA at some point in the future. But I guess it's just starting tonight. So this is a gateway program.
Absolutely.
A gateway forum. So our big questions were kind of around this issue of is there an opportunity to kind of leapfrog technologies, particularly in the developing world? And then how might technology be adapted or applied in a local context? And then whether there's a tension between, I guess the question assumed there was a tension between sustainable and economic development, which Professor Lal just spoke about. My role is, I guess, to be a spokesperson for the private sector, which is kind of interesting because usually if I'm on a panel like this, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, I work with early stage companies, and so usually there's someone from a really big company, but if they're there, they're being very quiet tonight. So I guess I'll just preface my remarks by saying when I talk about what I do, I am not a large company innovator, and that's important stuff too. And for sustainability to happen, those folks have to be at the table and they have to be incented properly. I guess I see the entrepreneurs more as the yapping dogs or the mammals around the stumbling dinosaurs as we close out this this era. I guess if looking at the overall title for this program of Innovating for Development and understanding the role of technology, I guess what I would hasten to add is whenever you hear about innovation and it's mostly focusing on technology, you're missing part of the conversation. And that part of the conversation is the one about a dissemination model or a business model. So there are huge numbers of what we call technology roadkill out there, which is technologies that have been launched without thinking through, for instance, whether people want the technology. These are kind of technologies that are good for you, but you don't know it. And we see a lot of that in our work. And I think part of the approach there is some great work that is being done by folks like Stu Hart at Cornell or Amy Smith at MIT, which is looking much more at what they would call indigenous creation or models where you're not imposing a technology into the developing world, but you're creating it with the developing world. And this very robust conversation that can happen where there may be people who know more about kind of the technology paint box, but others that are much more aware of the local context and needs. And so, and maybe a really interesting thing to think about, to put out there is we've seen recently with aid to Haiti what's happened when free food comes in and displaces the agricultural system that was there. And yet, I think sometimes, again, with the best of intentions, people are eliminating the creative capacity building and design capacity of people if they're imposing technologies that were developed here. So to take an example, if you have tremendous nanotechnology and you've got a great application of carbon nanotubes for cleaning water, your tendency here is to go work on that invention and maybe do a TED Talk and all these wonderful things that get us a lot of. But first, it's very important to go and find, like, is clean water the thing? If those people had $10 each per month extra, would they spend it on clean water or would they spend it on education? So understanding kind of how they want to make choices, I think, is is important, and it's incredibly hard. I don't pretend to be an expert. I tend to be someone who knows it's important and is trying to figure out how to do that. This idea of, and so maybe I can give you a couple examples and then we can get into the more general questions. So the work that I've been doing the most is in two companies who coincidentally have similar sounding names, and that's an accident, not on purpose. The first is EnviroFit, and what we have done is designed improved cook stoves, sometimes called clean cook stoves, but they aren't clean. They're just much cleaner than the alternative, which is cooking with a three-stone fire. So traditional cooking with biomass is about half the world's population, and it tends to be very rudimentary fuels, agricultural waste, dung, charcoal that's made in just about the most horrifically unsustainable ways possible. And so I guess we could take the approach of saying, how do we come up with a super systematic and systemic approach? Or we could say, let's just figure out a way to make a cleaner cook stove, which is what we've done. And we've designed that with a lot of work in southern India, doing research, going into homes, asking, how do you use your stove? What do you cook? What's important to you? And we're now selling cook stoves in southern India and about to move into Africa, and at a pace of 100,000 cook stoves a year, hopefully scaling that up. So we've scaled up from small scale, but we're still not huge. To give you just some idea of numbers, Apple last year sold its 100 millionth iPod. The world demand for cook stoves is estimated to be 500 million cook stoves. So I've just got to figure out how to sell 5 times more cook stoves than Apple's sold iPods. Just to kind of give you an idea of kind of so this idea of how technologies disseminate and how they move out and how markets help with that is an area that I'm still very much a student, and I encourage most everyone who works in this area that the attitude of being a student as opposed to an expert is the right way to approach it. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Let me make a couple of observations, then I have a couple of questions to start us off on. One is how unpredictable technology and its diffusion can be. One of the biggest public policy problems we had in New York City at the beginning of the 20th century was horse manure. It was all over Manhattan, lower Manhattan. You needed boots to get around. And nobody would have predicted that the solution was something called a horseless carriage, but there it is. 20 years later, there's no more horse manure. Now we have other problems, but that problem was eliminated. Nobody would have predicted, as I said earlier, 20 years ago, there would be 5 billion cell phones on the planet today. Nobody knew we needed them. But obviously, my teenage daughter can't live without it, so clearly it was a necessity I never understood. But how did that technology get disseminated, developed, disseminated, marketed, and brought all over the world and in incredibly rapid order, or the iPod? Another technology, none of us knew we needed 3,000 songs in our pocket at every moment. So that's one side of the equation. The other side is demographers talk about, and sociologists talk about, a demographic transition where children in traditional societies are an economic necessity. You have them because they're your social security, they work the farm, they help take care of you when you're old, and so forth. And then, as those of us who have college-age children know, children become what sociologists call decorative. They're not an economic necessity. In fact, we have them because of emotion, but they're not going to actually help us survive economically. And that, of course, leads to the demographic transition where in places like Japan, you're no longer even replacing your population. It's also a problem or an issue in Europe. So those are a couple of observations. The third one is actually the point that you were making about sustainability. We had Bill Gates visit the Earth Institute last year, and he said, I don't like the word sustainability. He said, do I want to sustain 1 billion people in extreme poverty around the world? That's not what we're after. We're after something else. But then he said, but I can't think of a better word for preserving the planet while we do all of that. But the fundamental question I want the panel to be thinking about is, as we think about sustainable development, or at least development that doesn't destroy the planet, and we think about technology, how do we get a handle on what is realistic in the development of technology, and how do we get a handle on using public policy to accelerate the process of diffusion? So I think those are fair questions, and we could go straight down the line here, or I could take somebody who'd like to volunteer to address it first.
Well, I'll be happy to address it. I won't have any time to think, but I'll speak anyway. And I guess the question you close with is how are we going to deal with diffusion? How are we going to get diffusion? What sort of policies we need? I think the first point is that we do need policies. That is, this isn't like the iPod because this is collective good. It's not even like a cook stove where you're protecting your own environment. It's a collective problem, so it's going to need policy. And I think that's an elementary point that actually is neglected in some of the early economic analysis of climate change, where there's sort of an assumption that technology can evolve without government support in this area, and I don't think that's true. How to do it is tricky, and it's cultural specific. And it's especially tricky because of the unpredictability that you highlight. It's still true that it's unpredictable how these technologies will evolve. The first thing to say is we can get diffusion of a lot without even getting into innovation and change. I mean, right now, around the world, there are zero carbon models in some societies, close to a zero carbon utility sector in France because of advanced nuclear design. You have very, very low carbon emissions in Brazil in the transport sector because of relatively advanced biofuels. So there are things that we know how to do. It's a matter of getting policies in place to make them happen. With renewable energy, so far the most effective thing has been these feed-in tariffs, where you offer a high price for renewables. And, the other, with nuclear, the thing has been absolutely rigid state control so that the design is chosen by the state, so that, in fact, there is no room for the private sector to screw up with accidents because you have a common design. So there's no one model. And it's a real complicated question how you get the government market mix right, because the advocates of emissions trading are kind of right that there are a lot of business people who come up with cool ideas and want to give them incentives to do them. On the other hand, they're not going to take care of the risk problem of some of these things. The government's going to have to do that, and they're not going to do anything that's expensive. They may do something on the energy efficiency side. They're not going to do anything expensive unless you have taxes or a cap or some kind of significant policy in place to make it worthwhile.
Lawrence, did you have something on that?
Yeah, just building on what you said and taking the example of France, it's very interesting because we had, of course, this 80% of the electricity out of the nuclear sector, nuclear power plants, and we engage, like many other countries in Europe, to develop a renewable program, basically through feed-in tariffs, so high price for electricity, out of solar and wind power. And there you see the complex mix between you need policies. It was, of course, and then it was set. I was in the government at that time when we decided for the feed-in tariffs for the solar energy and the wind energy. You could have said, oh, wait, it started a process. We will have decentralized power production, and then we need the next step is to need very good grids and in smart grids to use this capacity and to combine these two very different models, heavily centralized with a very decentralized. And so the story was nice and supported by the European policy and supported by climate talks. And you see that this construction about how you create, in a way, a system linked with, of course, obviously it was government-driven policies, and some actors really betting on that. And then from a sudden, because at one stage you begin to make the cost and benefit analysis, and then because of this uncertainty around should we go really to the low carbon economies, and all the system is really getting not destroyed, but with a lot of problems. Now in France, you have a number of economic actors screaming that we have to get rid of the renewable policy. We don't need it. That the emission trading market in Europe is inefficient, not giving signal enough to really to invest for these new energy sources. And so in a way you see policies are very necessary, but the steadiness, the resilience of the policy, the long-term aspect is key when you have investment cycle, and of course energy is a very long investment cycle. You as you said, you don't switch from one year to another one. So I think I see the problem where, because there is a lot of uncertainty, or that's really we can go to this low carbon economy. That's really the perspective. You have a lot of policies which seems very solid, and now we can be changed from, not from one day on the other, but really be undermined. And that's, I think, the main problem we have. It's about an industrial revolution, but can we have the policy signals that can last? Right. And in a way, I'm with a lot of questions now.
But I think if we think about the policy signals, and then you look at, say, the French political structure and the U.S. political structure being radically different. In Portuguese, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about the structure there, but you've got incredible variation in motivating the private sector, incredible variation, political culture and structure. So clearly, you've got to talk about a multiplicity of approaches that'll vary by location. We're not going to get in the United States a single model for a nuclear power plant that would get through 50 state governments with any, unless we have a national emergency and we nationalize energy production, which I don't think that the people that just took over the House of Representatives are going to permit. So I guess my question is to the panel, what do you think? How do we deal with this relationship between government and the private sector with all of these variables?
I keep on saying that although Portugal is an example in renewable energy worldwide, we have not used one dime of public money. And my belief is that without full participation of the private sector, this change cannot happen. But what change are we talking about? If we go back to my era story, this is 50% energy efficiency, 25% renewable energy, and let's put it 25% mobility. Ballpark figures. So the 50% of energy efficiency, it's not a breakthrough. It must be tens or hundreds of small improvements in technology, because we are talking about improving the efficiency of buildings, households, schools, industry. And this will be, like it or not, 50% of the savings in energy and CO2 emissions. It's not glamorous, but it's this small. I mean, efficient lamps, better windows, this 50%. Then one quarter for renewable energies. They are there. You have wind. Wind is fantastic. And with competition in feed-in tariffs, you almost are at grid parity. At the same time, for example, wind technology has improved substantially in the last decades. Now, so I don't believe in a breakthrough. I believe in these small steps in existing technologies. Then mobility. Mobility, I mean, we are close to second-generation biofuels, but we have hybrids, and we are extremely close to electrical mobility. So it is possible. In my view, we don't need a breakthrough like the mobile. Because if we need it, we would go to the problem in Europe. You know that Europe not only invests very little in R&D, but they put 90% on nuclear. Why? Energy policy tends to be dominated by the interest of nuclear companies, French companies. That, in my view, will not lead anywhere. And I repeat the calculation. 50% energy efficiency, 20% renewable energy, 25% mobility. So it's the addition of several small steps forward, but we are very close to go there. Now, without political will, without policies, change will not happen.
Okay. Go ahead, Paul. Then we'll get to Manu. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, just building on the, I think something even simpler about the European model is that you have a 20% renewable target, but there isn't, so that everybody agrees on that. So you have a framework, but then individual countries have a lot of freedom to decide how to do that. So if you look across Europe, you can see what they call green quotas and we call renewable portfolio standards, which are quantity standards. So you have to have a certain percentage of renewables. But other countries use these feed-in tariffs where you have a high price for the renewable energy and the quantity is a little more unpredictable. And some countries use hybrids of this. So there are a lot of variants in approach. And I would argue that used to be the predominant means of international environmental law. And one of the novelties, and maybe one of the unfortunate things in the Kyoto Protocol, was to push so hard on the particular policy mechanism, emissions trading is the way to do things. In Europe, you know, which was probably more inclined to taxation initially, went along with this. Partly because taxation was difficult to fit into the free trade regime, but you know, partly for the sake of having international cooperation on mechanisms, but that may be more important to have international agreement on goals and then diversity on mechanisms.
Manu, did you want to get into it?
I'm not a policy person, so let me preface things with that. But if you're making policies, I think traditionally, as I understand it, there are two main goals: to stimulate a particular direction or to regulate a certain outcome. And these things can work fairly effectively, but even as this conversation shows, typically policymakers focus on one goal, one outcome at a time. And this is a problem because if you look in the real world situation, you need to be carbon neutral, you need to be water neutral, you need to be nitrogen neutral, and we are going to run out of phosphorus, so we need to watch out for that. And there isn't a strategy or a discussion. So we move to biofuels are renewable, and hence this is good until we realize that, okay, they are going to zap all the water supplies in a particular place. So that's, you know, the way we have sort of done things in the past. Over the last few years, I've come to the realization that the world is only seemingly run by politicians, perhaps. It's actually run by multinationals, and it's not clear to me who runs them.
So it's not run by anybody. I don't know if anybody's told you this yet. As near as I can tell, it's chaos.
Right.
But I think the other thing I guess I would point to is that it isn't that public policy tries to solve problems. It actually tries to make them less bad.
Right, I understand.
And so I think in the sense what Professor Pino was saying, small-scale change does tend to be what happens, except when once in a while something interesting happens, like somebody invents a national power solution, as we saw in France. Somebody invents a solution to all the horse manure. Or in other words, you sometimes do see technologies have effects on the political economy of an area in ways that nobody would have predicted. I mean, nobody would have predicted that the interstate highway system was going to result in suburban sprawl, but it did.
Right. No, I agree. That's what I was sort of going to, is that if you look at the current era, what every multinational is trying to do is to argue that they are actually carbon neutral, water neutral, etc. They're moving in that direction because the bar has been set, in a sense. And so what I'm driving at is that sometimes it is not specific regulations, actions, but simply starting to articulate the bar. The example of the iPod, I would argue, is an example of marketing. No one really needs that stupid device. You know, you can listen to those 3,000 songs in rapid fire on anything else. But the fact that somebody created a marketing machine there, they made you think that this is what you want. And that, in a way, needs to be captured also from the policy direction.
What about higher education?
Higher education is totally a fraud, right? So that's why we're here.
Yes.
The issue is, of course, certain technology, you see the constituency behind, or piling, or really, and then you have, of course, this capacity to deploy because there are a number of a combination between policy vision, interest makes that technology develop. But in a number of cases, it's purely public good at the start. And there, I don't know how you evaluate the capacity of government these days. Of course, being European, the capacity of the government has really shrank to be able really to have a vision of what really should public programs be developed in universities, in a high-level education institution to really produce that public good. And we see that in the health sector, where now most of the research is done to private in the companies, which is good in a way, but on the other side, you lose that public good dimension, which is very important. And sometimes you cannot market everything. And when I look at how you look at the picture of the investment where R&D is now, you see a lot of sectors where, for example, on agriculture and on the new seeds or water management, of course, you don't see as much economic interest as the other sectors. So I think that dimension, and I think that if we want to achieve this different dimension of sustainability, there is a part of the public good there that it is we will need, and in a moment where at least the governments are not so much in capacity to produce that public good.
It's an interesting question. We'll start with Professor Haddad on this, because the issue I'd like to turn to is this issue of the role of government and the role of private sector in research and development, which is clearly at the building block issue here. Just to understand it, the Earth Institute, and so I'm a lobbyist here, we get about $100 million a year from the federal government in the United States. So it's not that the United States is bailed out of scientific research. The National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, NOAA, NASA, all of these, the Department of Energy, all fund a variety of different kind of research. Some of it very fundamental, a lot of it increasingly applied, but they are in that business. Then there comes a point in the science and technology development, the R&D development, where it has commercial potential. And then it requires the private sector participation. The personal computer, the internet, all of those technologies had fundamental research that the government sponsored. Then at some point, it leaves the government and goes into the private sector. So how do we get the entrepreneurs into this, and how can they play a role in development?
In just a few minutes, let me answer that one. So I think that to pick up on some themes that have already been talked about, the diffusion of technologies takes a long time. So as an example, the elements of the personal computer were around for a long time before there were personal computers, decades. And you have examples of entrepreneurs that have kind of launched too soon, and then someone else tries it again 5 or 6 years later and are more successful. So, you know, Google wasn't the first in search. And I wasn't necessarily defending the iPod. I was just saying that's the number of cook stoves I need to think about. And so how do I learn to be a marketer like Apple, as well as a designer like Apple, for our customers? But on the public-private sector, there are a number of things. So you also see some interesting clustering of entrepreneurial activities. So you know, there are hotbeds of entrepreneurship and even industry-specific hotbeds of entrepreneurship, and those are starting to shift, although Silicon Valley is still the dominant one. But there's a lot of concern around some of our government policies, for instance, around immigration, and the effect that they're having on our capacity to innovate. Because, frankly, we insourced a lot of our innovation over the last 20 or 30 years, and now we're doing a pretty good job of rapidly outsourcing it and then wondering where the jobs went, the entrepreneurs went. Entrepreneurship's a team sport. Entrepreneurship and innovation tends to happen at the margins or boundaries of fields and cultures. So the more you can throw disparate people together and get them interacting, the better. That's, I think, why universities have been good at it, and why there's some learnings about how to make your university better at it. And so things like the Earth Institute, where we were talking about before, they started out with geology, not a hotbed of innovation, right? Changes, you know, every few, you know, geological periods. So I think there's that. Often there's this theme, too, of well, we need more capital. Like entrepreneurs aren't being capitalized, and that's an area governments like to rush in and provide funding. And there are examples where it's worked and examples where it hasn't worked as well. I'd say one of the examples that it seems to have worked quite well is really the birth and dominance of the United States in biotechnology through a lot of work that was funded early by the NIH, as well as relying on universities with medical schools that didn't really have peers. But as you look around now and say, well, where is energy going to be, or where are the next technologies going to be, nanotechnology, where is stem cells going to move? I mean, we've done a lot of things that have made innovation much more global, and I rejoice in that, but I don't believe all of our politicians rejoice in that. So there's a real tension of for instance, EnviroFit is a global company. We're not a huge company. We have 10-ish employees in the U.S. and 50 outside the U.S. That's probably a model for a lot of entrepreneurial companies now. And when a congressperson shows up and asks us how many more jobs we're going to create in Colorado, and the answer is not many, but we're going to create a lot in Africa and India, you don't really want to get your picture taken with that particular congressperson at that time because they look like they just sucked on a lemon.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. The issue of the global scientific community and the global economy is one that, again, in my own job in the Earth Institute over the last 4 years, I've been struck by the degree to which the research community doesn't know borders, doesn't think in those terms, and in fact resents it when we say, well, we have to get that person a visa or they can't stay here for 2 months. And the need to work on that issue is something that I think I'm going to put aside for a moment, but I think is central. Professor Deasy, I think you were going to get into this.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about it. I mean, I think R&D is fundamental, and I think these entrepreneurial energies are great, but when we're solving these large collective problems like climate disruption, the entrepreneurs get frustrated and die when there's no policy to support it. And you've seen that with the solar industry in the United States, which has largely disappeared because there's no support for it. And by contrast, you have a lot of wind being manufactured for the Danish market and for the Texan market, by the way, where there's a strong renewable portfolio standard. And I think in the environmental area, what you have to understand is the government, not individual consumers, is the source of demand. There are a few exceptions to that. Organic agriculture is an exception to that because you can improve your own health by buying organic. So there's sort of a more like an ordinary market process there. And I think your cook stove example is similar, where you can improve your own health by using one of these stoves. So there's sort of an appropriable benefit like an iPad offers. But when you're talking about a large global problem like climate disruption, you really need government policy. And I think important as R&D is we can get an awful lot by what economists call learning by doing. And that is the phenomenon that when there are a lot of things out there, like hybrid vehicles is a perfect example. The reason we have hybrid vehicles is because of California low-emission vehicle standards. They made it very difficult to comply with using internal combustion engines because they were expensive. And before that, the manufacturers all had R&D going on. They all had wonderful prototypes. They had electric cars. They had all this stuff. But they weren't producing any of it. They said it was too expensive. Nobody would buy it. Well, then you have a policy that says, guys, you're going to have to produce something really low emission. And all of a sudden, they're figuring out, instead of devoting this little bit of resources into sort of research, it's becoming a major manufacturing task, a central focus of the company to figure out how to make these things cheap enough so that people can afford them. And all of a sudden, you have things like Toyota Prius, a pretty moderately priced vehicle that actually gets 45 or 50 miles per gallon. And so the policy is really important. And one thing that really bothers me about where the United States is at this moment is we used to believe in our entrepreneurs. We used to believe that if we set ambitious goals, if we had good policies, then we would figure out a way to do it and drive down the cost of doing things like going to the moon, right? And we seem to no longer believe that. We think if we have any government regulation, of any tax, of any policy at all, some intolerable and inescapable burden, a permanent cost that will never be escaped, will be put on the polity. And it just isn't true. Because historically, entrepreneurs have risen to these demands and figured out how to do these things.
I think we have a very
Levels, like, I mean, what entrepreneurs want is some predictability. Business wants some predictability. Right. So if there were a price on carbon, which I understand is evidently very hard for the U.S. government to do, and Europe's done it with some success, but it's still a young market. But I keep hoping that there are policies that get races to the top as opposed to races to the bottom. And right now in the environmental area, I think there's more of a race to the bottom than to the top.
A major obstacle we have, and I think you just pointed to it in this country, which you don't see in Europe, is this ideological view of anything government does to interact with the market is somehow going to be destructive. Every single piece of regulatory legislation that you hear about is now called a job-killing bill, even if in effect it actually will create whole new markets. So I think we're in agreement on that. The question is, how do we build the level of sophistication in this country to a place which is at least closer to what we see in Europe right now? Why don't we have our two Europeans talk to us about that?
For sure.
Don't be so sure.
You'll get there for sure when oil will go again to 140. And when it will get to 200, you'll get it there. And that is 100% sure. We are talking about an externality. And when there is an externality, there is a case for government intervention. Now, government intervention in what? Even here in our discussion, we've been talking about government intervention for R&D, for example, to environment, climate change. Now, in a moment where the rate of unemployment is almost 10% in the US, where you're concerned with foreclosures, where European countries are on their knees because the euro may explode, when China is growing at this pace. Now, selling an agenda for policy change and for financing R&D based on soft issues like environment and climate change, in my view, that is a mistake, and that is a mistake of the US and not only. Okay. Now, I would like to tell a very interesting discussion I had the other day in my class. We were debating China and the US. And we realized this is a big problem. 90% of the increase in demand will come from non-OECD countries. China should adapt. They are building a lot of coal power plants. And the answer of a Chinese student was the following: no problem. You invent the new technologies, we copy, and you sell it back to you. So this is the challenge we face, because the problems will come from there, but they will have an impact in the OECD.
Are there little garages in Beijing like they had in Silicon Valley, Professor?
That's, of course, in US, like in Europe, Europe was different, but not that different, with the idea that you have really to withdraw from the welfare state, that public spending was, even if we spend a lot, was not really the good thing, that government will always cherry picking, making mistakes on research and development. At the same time, well, and now, given that ideology, which I think is quite shared, even if there is an idea that we could have a collective effort in Europe to develop R&D, the idea that really government should play a big role is really not there. But at the same time, of course, China is developing the totally opposite model, where the push and pull is very much about pull. And the government is, of course, with different system, different structure, different regimes on tax and the public enterprise. You see an enormous amount of subsidies to this new technology. Not maybe on the only high range, but you see now what is a country investing more on renewable is clearly China. Of course, there is a size aspect, but in research, the size makes it all. Right. So in a way, I think we will confront with how views in Europe and in US, where the private sector will have the lead and the government should refrain from some pointing direction. And this confronted with an economy where the rationale is totally different. And I don't know what will be the outcome, but I see in China you see that everywhere in China. The universities, the capacity they have to receive funding is really incredible. And we will see, of course, now I understand that some trade unions here want to sue China in front of the WTO on the basis of the subsidies to renewable industry, because, of course, China is exporting all these solar panels in Europe and in US. But we will have this model confronting in global level, and it's very much about global issues and global R&D and global markets. And what do we do if China decided to do so? Do we should just sit and look at them? I don't know.
Interesting question. At this point, I wanted to open up the Q&A to members of the audience. So if what we've had to say so far seems interesting or provocative, if you'd like to, I guess, would you like them to go to the microphone if they have a question? Okay, because I think they're taping this. So if any questions, please come to the microphone and address them to our panelists. Or have we achieved perfect understanding on all of these issues already? Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you head over there and perhaps that, yeah, right in the middle there. There's a microphone. I think they want you to speak it. Yes. Well, you'll conserve energy. Yes.
I want to touch upon the last remarks on China, because it seems to me that it is the, how do they say, well, English is not my native language, 800-pound gorilla in the room. They have well, I mean, you don't need to be an expert, as I am not, but just reading religiously Tom Friedman, you get the impression that they will overtake the U.S. in that a particular field of renewable energy technology. But on the other hand, the theory goes that the kind of regime that they have is not very inimical to research, because, well, I don't need to go into what.
So the question for the panel is, what do we do about, is China a model, and what do we do if...
will they overtake the West, or in particular the U.S. in that?
Okay. Is it a foot race? Anybody? Manu?
I won't prognosticate on who will win, but I will say that I think at least one perspective might be, aren't we fortunate to have another billion people that are thinking about these issues and innovating, and when did we, the relative advantage of our country and our politics versus others. So if they can actually figure out how to make really low-cost, efficient solar panels more low-cost and efficient than we, that may be what we need to get to the 25% solar or renewables that Dr. Pignot was talking about. I think they have other challenges. The middle class across the world is going to grow by 1.8 billion people over the next 10, 12 years. That's astonishing. It's do those people all have the homes and the lifestyles that have the 50% energy conservation built into them, or do they take the most wasteful models? And that sway, we're focused a lot on the developed industrialized world right now, but the problem's going to be shifting to wherever those 1.8 billion people are. They aren't all in China, a lot are, but they're in Brazil and they're in Indonesia and they're in other places. And to try to deny them their right to use the markets to purchase the same resources we're going after seems unlikely. So
well, it's an interesting point also of whether or not we are in fact in such an interdependent global economy and political economy at this point that the old model of us and them may not really work, because there's so much interdependency in this system that, in effect, it's almost like we're enablers of each other. Right. You know, with the Chinese government and the Chinese entrepreneurs and capitalists can't really afford to see the middle class in the United States destroyed, because they'll be destroying their own markets.
And where I sit, the perspective is we're already working with Chinese companies to make our cook stoves, and it's so much more complicated than like where does the innovation arise and where does it get sold, because so many innovations, and I think so many more innovations, are going to kind of be sourced globally. And Columbia can work with a university in India, which, I mean, those things are happening now. They didn't happen 20 years ago. So I'm hopeful as opposed to despairing.
David?
I don't really have much to add to that. I think we are very interdependent. I think it's a profound challenge. What do we do about the decline of blue-collar employment in the U.S.? But I don't think the answer is to cut off development in China. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Lonnie?
No, thank God.
In fact, the mentality in the United States still is that we are the leaders in technological innovation, and China copies us, and Chinese products are subpar but inexpensive. The reality is that the incentives that China is putting in place for their technology development far outweigh what we see in the United States, and the products that are coming out are innovations beyond what you get here. Simple but innovative.
We have another question here.
Yeah. My question is related to energy. So last year, the House of Representatives passed an energy bill, but it's stalled in the Senate because not a single Republican senator wanted to sign on or tackle the issue. But yet the planet still warms and the environment gets worse. How does the U.S. catch up in terms of energy development and improve our energy policy and approach to carbon emissions when now Obama's dealing with an ideologically split House and Senate?
Anybody want to take a crack at that?
Well, it's not going to be possible, but there may be progress from states and local governments on these issues. And in fact, historically, energy policy is a state government issue. And so California, is a pretty important center of innovation. The Obama administration is also likely to do some things by executive action. It already has. A very significant thing that it did was to adopt automobile standards that are modeled after the California standards. So you're going to see big improvements, and we've already seen this helping our manufacturers actually, because they're not being so retrograde anymore. They're stepping up and getting out in front a little more in the energy trends and starting to make advanced vehicles, which they never did before. So I think there's going to be some progress in spite of the fact that it's impossible to get good climate legislation right now from the EPA and the states. But it's not going to be enough because the problem is so huge. We really do need the federal government to step up, and that's going to happen when you folks get out there and demand it.
Yeah, I would say the EPA is in fact moving to regulate greenhouse gases, and you'll see that. I think the state issue is actually more interesting. New York State, for example, taxes your electric bill. Now it's generating about $500 million a year, which is going back into energy efficiency projects by and large. California's been doing that for almost a decade and generates well over $1 billion a year from the same kind of taxation. So I think you are going to see state and local activity. But let's hear from the rest of the panel.
My suggestion, if I have any, of a very good friend of the United States, is to put somewhat the global warming agenda on the back seat, because there are other agendas which are no less important and that they mean something to the American people. For example, the agenda of energy security and that of competitiveness. Over the next 20 years, revenue of OPEC countries are estimated to increase by five. Who are the main oil reserves in the world is Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, and the like. China is buying all assets in oil. This means something to the U.S., and I think that strengthening the agenda for change with arguments that are not related with global warming, that can produce a positive effect on sustainability and global warming.
Okay. Are there other questions behind you? Sure.
So we've discussed how sustainability is a process and how there's going to be a lot of little steps leading up to that. But like most breakthroughs in technology, as we've seen in the last 100 years, may it be atomic bomb, or going to the moon, there's been a singularity or a moment that's caused that push, like World War II or John F. Kennedy making a proclamation that we should. And aside from $200 oil, I've not yet heard any other speculation about what may cause this singularity that will cause the transition from, or that great human push from the world we're in now to a sustainable world. And I was wondering, aside from the proposed $200 in oil, and we're on our last steps against the cliff, what could possibly cause that for us?
Professor Tubiano, how are we going to save the world?
Well, if we have known, we certainly, it would be nice to know how we make that push or that pull. I don't know what's the direction we should take. But what do we have in front of us? A mix of groups in countries who really think that it is a way to go, and you see them everywhere. There is I think no one country, no one big country at world level that doesn't think about having really a sustainability agenda. Chinese, 5 years ago, I'm a member of a Chinese Council on Environment, and we advise the Prime Minister and see him every year. 5 years ago, when sitting in this council, the idea was for China in 2020. Now it has changed totally. And you don't see any developing countries who is not thinking about this energy policy and the climate policy. But of course, it's only a group. There are very groups who doesn't think that it is the right way to go, even in China, where battles are fought very strongly, for example, around the stimulus package, and nowadays on the 12-year plan. So I think we have everywhere people who see the vision is there. And we are still in a discussion which we have to sort of to develop and to fight for. We have to fight for that vision. And we begin to see some economic interests who really see the same. And that's good that there are global companies that see that direction, and others, of course, are much more conservative. But the sea change in the automobile industry here in US, they were the more conservative at the world level. And now, because, of course, there's a crisis, and certainly, but internal debate within these big companies of what was the right model. So we are exactly in the middle of this discussion or fight or whatever you want to qualify it. And I think the only way, we don't have one mechanism. The only way is really to go and demonstrate and argue and try to sort of create business. But there is no central solution.
I think that's an excellent point, that if we had had this conversation, first of all, we wouldn't have had this conversation 20 years ago. And if we did, it would have been in a corner of room 1401 or something like that. We wouldn't have been up here. I actually started the environmental concentration at SEPA in 1987, and it was me and 4 people. So I guess the point, I think, is a good one, that we may be in the middle of this transition right now, and your awareness and the sense of the importance of the issue is, in fact, a part of the process that we shouldn't underestimate. Next question.
Great, thanks. Dr. Lala, throughout the dialogue, you mentions the role of multinationals in achieving things like carbon neutrality and water neutrality. I assume you're referring to companies like Pepsi and some of their innovation that they're really driving. The question for you and the other panelists is, does the public sector have a role in catalyzing innovation in multinationals, or are they, by definition, beyond the role of the public sector?
No, I think they definitely have a role in catalyzing. It's, in a way, I'll go back to the point that Paul made, it's marketing, right? And a comment that the king of Bhutan once made is that he banned advertising in the country because he said the only goal of advertising is to make you feel inadequate to buy something. So if you can actually use that to your advantage here, and you make people feel that essentially they're going to lose the planet unless they do some things, then that marketing angle works in both directions. So I think that's the push-pull between the multinationals, the environmental groups, and the public sector.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Shamik Bose. I'm a first-year student here at SEPA. And I wish there was a class on how to market to the bottom of the pyramid. I think it would be really interesting at SEPA. And the reason why I bring this up is that when you look at the bottom of the pyramid, as you say, the equation is completely different, right? There's these huge scales, and the prices have to be drastically shifted as well, because people that are consuming $1 a day, can they really afford to buy the gas stoves that you currently mentioned? So I guess my question is, is that, in that analysis, is that when a global public good can be created, such as a inventors incentive fund, so new inventors can enter the market, and the stability for the invention is guaranteed by governments that, hey, if you do discover something that'll work, then we'll step in and buy the product from you. So is there a way for the two sides to speak? Thank you.
David, go ahead, Professor Tabiano.
Not maybe for the moment totally in this new sector of energy and energy efficiency and decarbonization. We don't, for the moment, maybe we don't have innovative models of a relation between government and private sector. But when you look at the health issue again, this year, because malaria treatments or AIDS or more on disease were not really, there was no private research on them. We found through innovative foundation, like the Gates Foundation, there was a lot of discussion. Jeff Sachs here has a lot of initiative to create how could be the new model of research, knowing that the private sector has the information, so it's not they have to do it, but you have to create a new incentive model for them to be interested in these new diseases. And I think we have to look for these models. Because in a way, the companies have to have very different business model too. We have a very interesting conversation with a major electricity company in France, which I am advising sometimes. And the idea is how you will sell less electricity and more energy services, which is how you sell less and less electricity and more energy services. That's the way your new business model should be. And that, again, we are in the middle of the discussion here. And I see where if we could invent new models of relations that, looking at the health sector, I think it was interesting, that I think that could help. It's not the old generation maybe on pull and push system like of government on the 70s, maybe that's other models, but we should be quick to invent them anyway.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, if there is one, and then we'll do our wrap-up, so please.
Good afternoon.
Sorry, everybody else.
As Professor Cohen mentioned, this conversation would have not taken place a couple of years ago. And I feel that there's a big role in putting the environmental issues into policy discussions thanks to scientists. So my question is, what is the role of scientists in the policy world? And if they should, what should they do? What is their role?
I think we only have one scientist here, right, Manu? So you're going to have to speak for your whole community.
I don't know. Depends on what you call science. If science is the pursuit of truth, right, which is the same as the goal of religion sometimes, depending on how you define religion, then I think science is the flag bearer of advance warning of possible outcomes, as well as the tool by which people can be guided as to the feasibility of certain goals. You know, the individual who asked about landing on the moon, probably someone thought about landing on the moon as a good idea in 5000 BC, but could not execute it. So at a certain point, science gets to the stage where you can say, yes, this is feasible, and hence you need to now be able to do something. And I think that's fundamentally the role that scientists can play. What they should play is a value judgment, so I'll stay away from that.
Okay. First, I want to, before the panel even begins their summation, I want to thank everybody involved in this. It's been a very interesting conversation. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us some concluding thoughts about the role of technology in sustainable development from their own perspective. And then I understand after that we're going to have a reception. And so I'm always aware of the fact that I don't want to be between a group of students and liquor. So I'm cognizant of the need to sum this up to get to your reception. So, Paul.
So I'll build on the young man who asked about marketing for the BOP class, because I'm always afraid with forums and conferences that we just talk about things and nothing happens. So I will challenge you guys to figure out how to make that happen at Columbia. There are a growing number of faculty that are teaching classes like that, so the syllabi are out there. So you just need to go find a faculty member who's willing to kind of put themselves out there and maybe expand not just to the BOP, but how to use marketing, as my colleague Dr. Law has been talking about, to achieve good, and maybe look at whether marketing really is just about creating needs for things or wants for things that you don't need, or whether marketing has other roles. To me, what we're facing is where we need policymakers, we need scientists, we need business people all to be working, and with great urgency. The business as usual isn't working, and I understand as a business person, business is the first part of business as usual, and it's a great challenge. For me, I look at this as a time of a lot of opportunity, but it's also probably a time of a lot of destruction in terms of destroying some of the things that don't work as well. And I hearken back to what an economy does is trade in goods and services, and we've totally lost our anchor to both those words as you think about them. So think of companies whose goods are really good, or think of companies whose services really serve. It's a short list, and I'd encourage you all to be involved in thinking about working for the ones where their goods are good, or starting ones that do that.
Thank you. Professor Law.
So there's this saying I've heard since I was a kid, which is the meek shall inherit the earth. And I always wondered what they were trying to get me to understand. And I realized that perhaps what they're trying to tell me is that the evidence is that the meek are coming in last in everything that you see. But I guess another way to look at that saying is that it points at essentially what we have learned from biodiversity. Anytime we have an ecological system which turns to monoculture, eventually it vanishes. And if you have a mix of strategies, if you have a mix of groups trying to look at these problems, then you end up with a more stable situation. So whether we look at the policy side or the technology side or countries such as China or countries such as Bangladesh, strategies pursued by different groups are somewhat different. And I think the richness of maintaining that is somewhat important if you're looking at sustainability of the planet. So if you take all the questions that people were asking and say, what is the right thing? My answer is there is not one right thing. We have to keep playing this game, and we'll keep bashing our head against the wall and survive. Professor Tubian.
I think we are facing a very big challenge because of this variety of this diverse point of view, the diverse models, and the globalization where we are so dependent. There is a very nice video on YouTube I really advise you to look at, which is about China and US, and it's called We Are Codependent Economies. It's very funny. It's about, of course, the currency war. But we are in that type of world, and I see there from this very specific point of view where I'm working in the climate talks, that we need to make the different countries, the different groups understand what the other is doing. And not in a sort of a bashing way, but understanding the different models that are at work. And I think that task, which is very much an intellectual work, but a communication work and information work too, is essential, because we need to really combine different intelligences and understand that the choices may be different, but to build a common vision, to build common anticipation, which is we need to go to this sustainability development model. We need to understand the differences. And I see there the point where maybe there is a huge effort to make, that to build converging views, we have to accept the differences, and we are not there. And second, I would say that it's fascinating how your generation are really pushing us. I remember my first classes in Sciences Po on environment were very sort of the alphabetization, how things are and how much we have water problem and food problems. And nowadays, and the concern that people should be really the consciousness and awareness on the risks. And that was a time that was difficult to get the same vision of the risk. And now my students say, well, sure, that part of the course is we don't need to know why people doesn't have the same vision of the risk. We already know that. We know that the risks are there. You don't have to convince us. And why it's so difficult for your generation to have a common vision, a common assessment of the risk. And that is, I think, the main difference. And in this country, maybe the representative in the Senate or in the House are not that conscious, but you are. So I think these things will change very quickly.
Okay. Professor Pina.
Well, firstly, once again, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be in this panel and facing you. So thank you very much, Columbia, again. Then, regarding technology, we need a roadmap. And the set plan, the new energy era that I came here, that I brought here to you, is exactly that. It's not the specific measures, but it's a roadmap. We need the vision of the new energy era of the future. I think that in this discussion, we have strengthened our agreement on what matters now is China, China, China. So without taking into account what will happen in China, it's not possible to frame our energy and environment policy, because what we do impacts on China, what China does impacts in the rest of the world, and it's such an order of magnitude that what will happen there will be really determined. Two last small suggestions. Please don't continue the mistake on putting all the emphasis on the environment. That doesn't happen in Europe. Europe has, on the environment side, probably a policy which is more advanced than in the US. But the reason for that is that, number one, we have very high taxes on fuel, on gasoline. And number two, because for us, the problem of energy security is much stronger than here. So this suggestion, don't put all the weight on sustainability. And lastly, as an European, it's almost the first time in my life that I participate in a meeting where Europe is praised relative to the US. So you cannot imagine, for me, it's really a privilege.
Well, the food has been better for a long time. So. Professor Dries.
Well, I think we've left the era where just getting more and more stuff produces more prosperity. I mean, that's not what's happening. In the United States, the middle class has declined. Joblessness has increased because of mindless, senseless, useless financial innovation. Now, what we need is innovation in a particular direction, to use Herman Daly's idea, innovation that will reduce the throughput as we produce a good life for people. And that's going to require a real change in attitude in this country to make that come about. And that attitude is sort of a prerequisite for having effective climate policy to create the climate where entrepreneurs will produce the innovations and refine them to bring down the cost of doing what we need to do about climate disruption. So I'd urge all of you to go out there and work really hard to try to produce that change in attitude, because right now we don't seem to be capable of doing the most elementary things. And I agree with what was said, by the way. It's not just about environment, it's about jobs. We're not going to have jobs if we just continue to use every last drop of oil until it disappears. It just won't work.
Okay, thank you. I'll put in a last word from my own perspective. As the panels were talking, I was thinking about New York City, where some of the things that we've been talking about that needs to happen have in fact started. And why? Well, first, 40% of the people that live in New York City were born in other countries. If you include people who are here illegally, it's probably closer to 50%. If you include the million students in New York City, on any given, college students, I should say, college and graduate students, we have about 1 million elementary school through high school students here just in the public system. This is the post-industrial global city. We used to make things in New York. We don't make very many things here anymore. We make ideas and we bring people together from all over the world to talk about policy and to think about things. This isn't going to be the only thing that's done here, but it is one of the main things that's done here. So I actually have, and I think it was Professor Tubiano that said this, I have confidence because of you and because of the characteristics of this city that brings groups like this together and has done that and is, in fact, institutionalizing it in the universities here and in the media here and, of course, in the United Nations. And so I have a high level of confidence that we are going to make this transition. I'm always reminded of Malthus' prediction that we'd all be starving by now, which didn't turn out to be the case because of technology. So, in fact, there will be some of these changes. It's not going to be simple and straightforward, but I want to commend the Journal of International Affairs, which is a very unique institution in and of itself, in taking on these issues. The journals over the last several years have been taking on all the tough issues. And I was walking through the lobby earlier today and seeing all the old journal covers from back in the beginning era and some of the issues that people were discussing. And it's clear that the study of international affairs, as reflected by the journal, started quite narrowly. And of course, coming off of World War II, the focus on security issues was an obvious one, but is now broadened to all of these issues of sustainable development. And in fact, I'm incredibly encouraged by it and encouraged by the discussion that we had here tonight and your ability to attract all these great people here. And I'm even more encouraged by the fact that you sat patiently while all of that food and drink was sitting in the lounge there. So again, thank you, everybody. Wonderful event, and congratulations.
Would you please join me in thanking our wonderful panel tonight, please?